It's a real honor to be at the Danube Institute, a place where what the ancient Greeks called and the New Testament calls paresia, or fearless speech, is held to be a right and a duty. Jan Patočka lived and died as a fearless speaker, both in Nazi-occupied and then communist-occupied Prague. It's fitting then that nearly a half-century after Patočka's death, the Danube is hosting this series of lectures in formerly Nazi-occupied, formerly communist-occupied Budapest. Just a couple of years before he died from trauma sustained during a brutal police interrogation, Jan Patočka circulated as samizdat, underground literature, a collection of 6 heretical essays. And in this lecture, you'll only be hearing about the first. But before we turn to Patočka's first essay, I should perhaps say a few words about our theme in all 6 lectures. And the theme is Patočka's dissident philosophy of history. Patočka wrote towards the very end of his life that, quote, "a different conception of history is hard to come by." The task of these lectures is to introduce you to Jan Patočka's different conception of history, but we must of course ask, different from what? Patočka breaks with the materialist and determinist idea of history that served as state doctrine in the communist bloc. This is why Patočka is called, in our lecture's title, a dissident. To hold a non-materialist philosophy of history in his time and place was a risk, and to propagate it was arguably a crime. The Marxist philosophy of history, in Patočka's words, is a theory of objective conflicts, tensions, contradictions. And Patočka rejected this theory, asserting that history is foremost, in his words, a history of the soul. But Patočka's philosophy of history is not only anti-materialist and thus anti-Marxist. In it, he also develops a deep and a nuanced critique of progress. This is Patočka. He writes, quote, "The conception of history which holds progress for an absolute necessity, which requires the sacrifice of individual subjectivity, is so widespread that we can, without exaggeration, consider it a latent or overt historical philosophy which dominates contemporary humanity." Patočka seems to believe that a progressive materialist conception of history dominated the capitalist West circa 1975, no less really, though far less brutally, than it did the communist East. In other words, Patočka seems to insinuate that he might have been a sort of dissident in London or New York circa 1975, much as he was certainly a dissident in Prague. There are, of course, other examples of Soviet dissidents who issued stern critiques of Western materialism. Alexander Solzhenitsyn comes to mind. Well, materialist progressivism was overt doctrine in the communist bloc, but it seems to me that Patočka is indicating in the passage I just read that it was a latent doctrine of the capitalist bloc in the late 20th century. Perhaps one way to think of the intensification of progressive tactics and commitments in Europe and the Americas in the last decade or so is this. In the post-Cold War era, the West's latent progressivism has simply become overt. Like the dissolved Soviet East, a now seemingly dissolving West, quote, holds progress for an absolute necessity which requires, in Patočka's words, the sacrifice of individual subjectivity. Patočka's philosophy of history is heretical because he refused to let his individual subjectivity be sacrificed. He criticized the state-promulgated philosophy of late Soviet Prague. In the process, he no less forcefully criticized, quote, any conception of history which holds progress for an absolute necessity. It is this, I think, that makes Patočka our contemporary in post-Cold War Europe. He is a critic of materialist progressivism tout court. With that said, we can return to Patočka's basic concept, which I mentioned a moment ago. History, Patočka writes, is foremost a history of the soul. As could be predicted, he infers from this that European history is a history of the soul. According to Patočka, the care for the soul is what gave rise to Europe, as we'll be hearing in a later lecture. The crux is that Patočka sees Europe as a spiritual formation. For him, Bolshevism and Nazism, and for that matter, progressivist capitalism, are spiritual deformations of a continental culture which had its roots in the Greek democratic cities, in the Roman Empire, in ancient and medieval Christianity, in a vast, if spectral order called the Holy Roman Empire. If such an idea of Europe strikes us as being both mystical and provincial, it's nevertheless the case that Patočka holds it. And as he reminds us, he is not alone. Quote, Hegel and other Europeans of his age, he writes, do not for a moment doubt the spiritual origins of European unity. Patočka then adds, their conception is certainly correct. In contrast to Hegel and his epigons, Patočka denies, however, that history is inexorable. For him, there can be no science of history, a la Marx. On the contrary, Patočka's idea of history has, I will argue, the structure of a mystery. It exceeds us and all our powers in duration, complexity, and depth. We are free, but our freedom is part of that mystery. The awful responsibility of living in history calls us to convert, to change our minds and change our lives. Patočka uses the same word for this sort of conversion, the Greek word metanoia, that we find in certain ancient philosophical texts and indeed in the Gospels. History, Patočka writes, means first this inner process. In an epoch which is dominated by spurious imperatives of progress, Patočka says that those who have been converted to philosophy, he calls them the shaken, will, quote, not fear being unpopular, but will be willing to say to various regimes, no. None of this makes Patočka by any means a reactionary philosopher. I stress that unlike many of his contemporaries, Patočka resisted both the Nazi occupation in Prague, which he survived, and the communist occupation of Prague, which he did not. But if Patočka is no reactionary, he is certainly a cautionary philosopher. In the very last pages of his final heretical essay, Patočka writes this: the shaken will not offer positive programs, but will speak, like Socrates' daimonion, a tutelary spirit who only ever warned the philosopher Socrates what not to do. Like Socrates' daimonion, the shaken will only offer warnings and prohibitions. Philosophy, he writes, can and must create a spiritual authority that could drive the warring world to some restraint, rendering some acts and measures impossible. What then can you hope for from our 6 lectures on Patočka's 6 heretical essays? Well, a philosophy of history that urges restraint on a warring world, and that hopes, however vainly, to render some acts and measures impossible. Patočka is a dissident who says not only to 20th century Europe's nihilistic, nocturnal movements such as communism and Nazism, but perhaps to some of its 21st century successors, no. This first lecture on Patočka will follow the structure of his first essay. Rather than tell you beforehand how this essay unfolds, and Patočka never does this himself, I will just note that the lecture has 2 parts and a conclusion. In part 1, we'll see that Patočka opens the heretical essays with 2 problems concerning the very idea of the world. One of these difficulties is distinctly modern, and the other is not. In part 2, I will sketch Patočka's idea of the world before history. On Patočka's telling, deep antiquity is a world of human bondage. In Patočka's state of nature, as in the earliest human empires and writing cultures, life is intensely meaningful, but it is not free. It is only in the lecture's brief conclusion that history will begin. In the way that Patočka defines the word, it is both perilous and virtuous to enter history. But the time has come for us to work through the first of Patočka's heretical essays, beginning with part 1, which is titled Two Problems with the Idea of a World. Patočka opens the heretical essays with a demanding reflection on what a forgotten anti-materialist philosopher of the late 19th century, Richard Avenarius, called the human world concept. Now, this is presumably not the Professor Avenarius who fails to appear in the first pages of the Czech novel Immortality by Milan Kundera, but to be honest, I have no way of knowing. Patočka's handling of Richard Avenarius' problem of the human world concept is highly abstract, but I think it can be simply stated. Mathematical physics has generated theoretical constructs so complex that it is virtually impossible to recognize in them the human world of our experience. Patočka's first question, then, is this: when we refer to the world, are we referring to a mathematico-physical conception of it, in which, if certain theoretical physicists can be trusted, our sense of time passing, for instance, is entirely illusory? Or are we referring to the world that we share as I speak, the world in which my sentences must begin before they can end, and so on? To render this question even more concrete, I would like to glance at the pages of a notebook that a young Hungarian novelist, Miklós Zenkovi, kept not far from where I am now seated in the summer of 1934 in Budapest. In the scene I have in mind, Zenkovi lies sweating in bed. He stares at the lathes of the roller blinds in his bedroom and what he calls the milky blue leaves of his houseplants. Budapest is hot, fermenting at daybreak. But it is not only the city's heat that makes him sweat. Zenkovi is also sick with fever. So waves of ultra-hot particles are blasting out of the sun, loosening the foliage of the trees in Budapest. And a wavelet of toxicity is being excreted by Zenkovi's gallbladder, heightening and disordering his sensations. The sphere of outer heat is nothing less than our world. The sphere of inner heat is little more than Zenkovi's sickbed. Yet both types of heat are physical and real. There is a sun over Budapest, and the novelist has an inflamed gland. Zenkovi is obsessed by the fact that mathematico-physical descriptions of the sun, or physiological descriptions of his fever, can't capture his experience of the sun's heat, or his experience of a high fever. He accepts, and he is clearly fascinated by, the newest materialist descriptions of the sun and of his sickened body. Yet Zenkovi is convinced that no materialist description can render his perceptions of sunlight or his sensations during an illness. Later in this same notebook, Zenkovi makes a related observation that struck me forcefully when I first read it a number of years ago, and has haunted me ever since. Zenkovi observes that woman is not a mathematical concept. Woman is a concept which concerns Zenkovi in this notebook and throughout his oeuvre. In a purely mathematical field or domain, Zenkovi points out, there can be no concept of woman, and thus there can be no purely mathematical description of women. This seems to me to be a momentous insight. We've held for several centuries that the world is ultimately mathematically describable. And yet in the modern world, which is constituted by mathematico-physical description, as increasingly in our digital simulacral world, there are and can be no women. Now, there is arguably nothing more ultimate for a human world concept, to recall Richard Avenarius' phrase, There's arguably nothing more ultimate for a human world concept than woman, since all humans have been and are born of women. And yet, as Zenkovi intuits in this jotting from 1930s Budapest, one of modernity's world-defining sign systems, the mathematical, cannot recognize or describe women. All of this is simply meant to introduce us to the depth of Patočka's opening problem, which is this: late moderns live in at least two worlds. One that is exhaustively captured by mathematico or thoroughly captured by mathematico-physical descriptions, and another that Patočka calls the world of our life, the Lebenswelt, a German term of art. The one Patočka consigns to a unitary materialist conception of history, and the other he calls a human world, a world of sense perception and natural language articulation. Patočka's question is this: is it possible at this late hour to philosophically reconcile our worlds, the world of mathematical physics and the world of sensations, affections, intuitive orientations? In the first pages of his first heretical essay, Patočka sketches the contributions made to this problem by two philosophers with whom he'd studied in the 1930s. Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger. Both Husserl and Heidegger were exponents of a tradition of 20th century European philosophy to which Patočka belongs, named phenomenology. The term means roughly the analysis and interrogation of phenomena, of what appears. So I should say a few words about Husserl's and Heidegger's philosophies as Patočka represents them in his first essay, for both philosophers help to orient Patočka's thinking throughout the heretical essays. To heroically simplify matters, Husserl elaborates a philosophy of phenomena, of what appears, that is centered upon structures of human intentionality. Husserl strives to reconcile the modern world of mathematical physics and the world of our life by analyzing the worlds appearing to be to humans in the form of objects. In contrast to Husserl's object-oriented philosophy, Heidegger, who is a protege of Husserl, Heidegger endlessly circles what Patočka calls a deep phenomenon. This deep phenomenon is a mode of appearing that all human intentions, even lies, misperceptions, and illusions, share, for they all, in a word, are. They all appear in obscure and multifarious ways to be, as we ourselves are, even when we deceive or are deceived. And if the world is all that is, then however we may conceive it, the world itself is. And Heidegger tirelessly asks, what is that? What is it to be? Heidegger calls it being. Patočka, I think, calls it a mystery. For Heidegger, a pre-theoretical world of sensations, affections, and so on can reveal being no less than, and perhaps far more than, the theoretical world of mathematical physics. Though he is indebted to Husserl's philosophy of human intentionality and Heidegger's philosophy of being, Patočka gently brushes aside their efforts to reunite the modern worlds of pre-theoretical human life and modern theoretical physics. The problem of the world, Patočka somberly concludes, appears to us to be unsolvable. Why is this? Because Patočka's philosophy, unlike Husserl's and Heidegger's, is a philosophy of history. And this brings us to Patočka's second problem with the world. There is a chasm between the world of humans and the world of mathematical physics. And we, in late modernity, we inhabit both worlds. But the problem of the world is deeper than this, because even the common world of humans is unstable. This is Patočka's second problem in the first Heretical essay. The human world changes, he says, because manifestation is itself historical. Since phenomenology is a reflection on what appears, on phenomena, we can ask, how does the world appear to us? And to be sure, the world appears to be a vast system of change. The world itself is unstill. The being of the world and our being in the world alter. The world becomes what it was not, and it ceases to be what it was. We cease to be what we were, and we become what we were not. This is what Patočka calls the primordial historicity of the world, an idea which he distinguishes from history. So before humans even come to figure in Patočka's dissident philosophy of history, he notes that the historicity of the world simply as manifesting change, can be divided into epochs. Epochs which seem to have been caused by, say, continent rupturing tectonic shifts, by sea cooling clouds of volcanic ash, and so on. These are geological epochs, we would say. But it is not only material cataclysms which generate epochs. For humans elaborate what Patočka calls pictures of the world. And like glaciers or rock formations, human world pictures are eroded and destroyed over time. There are therefore not only epochs of the world, but epochs of world pictures. For instance, an epoch of the world might be the Holocene or the Anthropocene, and an epoch of a world picture might be modernity or late modernity. Patočka writes this about the problem of world pictures in history. In all human uncovering of being, originating in history, there emerge ever new historical worlds, in his scare quotes. We do not even perceive in the same way, he says, as ancient Greeks, even though, physiologically speaking, our sense organs are the same. Humans in a secularized epoch see not only different things, but see them differently than one who can say, panta plere theon, all things are full of gods. Who is Patočka citing here? What is this Greek phrase, panta plere theon, all things are full of gods? Well, this is a dictum that the philosopher Aristotle in the 4th century BCE attributes to a 6th century BCE philosopher, Thales or Thales of Miletus. And why, we should ask, why is Patočka citing Thales here? We've just been discussing Husserl and Heidegger. It seems like quite a shift to then begin discussing Thales of Miletus. To clarify, I suggest that we recall the scene of Miklos Zenkovi sweating in bed in the early 20th century. For Zenkovi, as I tried to indicate, the sun is a mathematically analyzable cauldron in space. That is Zenkovi's world picture, and it is our world picture. However, the world picture of Thales' contemporaries differs in a profound way. For them, the soul is a divine ensouled being. Thales himself is said to have attributed a soul to all natural bodies, such as magnets. Though he is reputed to have been the first Greek to predict eclipses of the sun, Thales presumably held the sun to be a living being. We find more complete evidence of this living sun idea in Plato's final dialogue, The Laws, where Plato is disturbed that although pious Greeks still see the sun and moon, stars, and the earth as instances of deity, those who have been corrupted by novel theories hold that the celestial bodies are merely earth and stone, blind and unthinking, even as they illumine human affairs. So Thales and Plato and Zenkovi all beheld our sun from their manifold positions on the earth with what were undoubtedly physiologically human eyes, and yet Patočka reminds us it is not the same to see a mathematically analyzable cauldron in space and to see a radiant and benevolent deity. Patočka concludes that ancient Greeks and we who live in a secularized epoch not only see different things, a divine brightness or a cauldron in space, but we see them differently, as an all-seeing numen or as a source of capturable heat. So, to reprise the first part of Patočka's first essay, the world of mathematized physics cannot be made perfectly commensurable with the world of human experience. And the world pictures of other epochs cannot be made perfectly commensurable with our own world picture. It is because of this that in Patočka's judgment, the problem of the world is destined to remain unsolvable. It is certainly no mistake, then, that what Patočka calls history is also unsolvable. The world is unsolvable because of history, and history is unsolvable because of the world. Nor is it a mistake that, in Patočka's conception of the world before history, it seems to have lacked one thing only: a sense of its own insolubility. Part 2. The world before history, a theory of human bondage. What is the world before what Patočka calls history? What does the world say of nomadic tribes in deep antiquity, of the first settled cultivators and the first dynasts in walled cities, of the slaves, priests, and regents in only hazily remembered empires and city-states? What are the contours of a world picture before Thales, about whom we were just speaking? These are Patočka's questions in the second half of his first heretical essay, and I believe he reaches 3 conclusions in his theory of the world before history. First, there is a fascination with death in the world before history. What Patočka calls death's dark empire is a close and observable presence within the world of deep antiquity. In claiming this, Patočka is setting up a contrast in his 6th and final essay, where he states, in a passage that we'll later refer to, he states that death does not exist for late moderns. Patočka, of course, doesn't mean that we don't die. Rather, he means that late modern cities function in some respects as if there were no death. Mourning, which may be the oldest human ritual, has been virtually abolished in much of the late modern West. For us, death is only cognizable as an absence. And in deep antiquity, death, on the contrary, was felt to be a presence. For Patočka, this archaic presence of death and early humans' fascination with this presentness of death is encoded in the Tree of Knowledge narrative in the first pages of Genesis. It's encoded in the Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, where a Herculean figure, Gilgamesh, wildly flees before he finally faces, far more dramatically than the first man in Genesis, Adam, the full measure of his mortality. Another motif which is shared by Genesis and the Gilgamesh cycle is that of a world-burying flood. Patočka seems to think that this flood motif in ancient Babylonian and Hebrew texts may not be entirely mythical. However that may be, what Patočka sees in the flood motif is a chilling recognition in deep antiquity that it is not only individuals who are threatened with death. Rather, archaic humans seem to sense that, quote, all of humankind could be unstoppably swept away, apparently at any time. The inference that many of these early poets drew from this is that, in Patočka's words, humans can never secure their lives by labor. And this points us to Patočka's second conclusion, which is this. He articulates, or he rather sees articulated in deep antiquity, the futility of human labor. The world before history was not, for Patočka, a garden of innocent delights. On the contrary, it was a dark landscape sculpted by human toil. If it is death that bounds the dark power of finite life in Patočka's first conclusion, it is toil that reveals how finite life is ever exhausting itself in his second conclusion. Death is the never more than half obscured master of archaic labor. The link between work and life, says Patočka, is death. Patočka sees ancient poetry and scripture as a far more impressive testament to the sources of human bondage than Georg Hegel's pages on master and slave in one of the 19th century's most celebrated texts, Phenomenology of Spirit. Rather than centering his analysis on the divergence of masters and slaves, self-consciousness, and deep antiquity, Patočka stresses what masters and slaves share in deep antiquity. And this is what he calls subservience to life. He rather brutally describes this aspect of archaic consciousness as slavish. Human consciousness itself is oppressed in deep antiquity by what Patočka calls the bondage of life to itself. And what is that? Patočka tries to speculatively establish the necessity of existing in deep antiquity in such a way that life is devoted to the care of life. The care of life is cyclical and unbreakable, like Sisyphus' toil in Greek myth. Patočka believes that the care of life, is the root and origin of all human bondage. Without care of the soul, which is introduced by Greek philosophy and deepened by Christianity, Patočka believes that human life has been relegated to what he calls Sisyphean toil in the service of self-devouring life. We'll see in our second lecture that Patočka is not, to his mind, denying the resplendence of Babylonia and Egypt, Persia, and China when he writes this. But he sees all of these early civilizations as caught up in the care of life. Patočka's third conclusion about the world before history is that the first cities and empires and the earliest writing cultures are not structured by care of the soul, but by a fascination with death and a bondage of life to itself. He is certainly not denying that the form of life of the first high civilizations is rich with meaning. Human toil, prayers, and sacrifices reflect and uphold a divine life which is beyond all toil and all death, which is the life of divine beings. This is true within archaic households, and this is true within cities and empires which were pictured from the beginning, so Patočka argues, as households of the gods. Patočka stresses that there is no sharp boundary between the world, meaning the world picture in deep antiquity, and the great household of the city or the empire. For him, this is crucial. The archaic household, city, and empire were all held to be divinely ordered reflections of the world. Thus, the unquestioned meaning of the world, which is given in archaic myth, bestows its meaning at the same time and in the same way on human households, human cities, and human empires. This is why Patočka will break with the common notion that the origin of history coincides with the origin of writing, and thus that every writing culture gives rise to history in the proper sense. To Patočka, many writing cultures seem to intensify the Sisyphean toil of humans without promising them liberation. Patočka thinks he can discern in the mirror of their poetico-mythical texts that even archaic monarchs, kings and queens, whose form of life was upheld by the forced labor and deaths of huge numbers of slaves, he thinks that these monarchs experienced their lives as perennially threatened, dedicated to death, and devoted to toil. He then asks, and is not this picture essentially truthful? Does it not grasp human life in its essence? I take him to be asking in this way, aren't we still mortal? Aren't our lives, cities, empires perennially threatened? Aren't we hollowed out by work, whether our own or that of others? Aren't we living in dread of a war or a contagion, a machine intelligence, or some obscure sequence of catastrophes that could put an end to humankind? In a word, yes. This picture of human life is not untruthful. Patočka therefore suggests that deep antiquity's finite life that is bound to itself is not imperfect because it is untrue, but rather because it is unfree. It is not error per se, but the bondage and subjection of human consciousness in a world before history, which makes what Patočka calls history a moral necessity. Conclusion. Why is it necessary for a history of the soul to commence? If the basic contours of the world before history are essentially truthful, as we've just heard, then what is lacking? Perhaps one thing only, writes Patočka at the end of the first essay, and that is questioning. He elaborates, quote, "To uncover what is hidden entails questioning. It means discovering the problematic character not of this or that, but of the whole as such, as well as of the life that is rigorously integrated into it. Once, however, that question has been posed, humans set out on a long journey. It is the journey of history. In Patočka's dissident philosophy, history begins not with writing, but with questioning, and human questioning's recurring, orienting, enduring question is, what is the world? Or said differently, what is the whole? What is all that is? It is only in formulating this question that we place ourselves in a posture of freedom towards and responsibility for the human meaning of the whole. Now, it is constitutive of myth that its veracity, its truthfulness, is taken to be pre-given. The one who transmits myth seeks to be absolved, one could say, from any responsibility for it. Even if a myth is essentially true, those who allow it to remain mythic, that is, to remain unquestioned, necessarily, according to Patočka, necessarily remain unfree in their orientation to its truth. For Patočka, it is only questioning which can reconstitute mythic truths as truths which are held in freedom. And it is the imperative to hold human truths in freedom which gives rise to what Patočka calls care of the soul. Since he holds that history is foremost a history of the soul, he holds that history in a strict sense can only begin with care of the soul. The soul's first gesture in history, its first awakening to itself as being in need of care, is questioning. And this first gesture is made, Patočka believes, in the democratic cities and in the singular writing culture of ancient Greece. There will be more on this in the coming lectures. But to conclude this first lecture, we glanced earlier at the archaic Greek philosopher Thales, and we can return to him now. For Thales was thought in antiquity to have been the first to formulate something like the epochal question, what is the world? According to an ancient book of lives of the philosophers by Diogenes Laertius, Thales' reply to this question, what is the world, is as follows: the origin of all that is rests upon water, and the beautiful whole, the cosmos, is ensouled and full of gods. It's not the convincingness of Thales' idea that matters here for us. What is world-altering is the question that seems to have inspired them. The question is, what is the world? It is in this act, this posture of questioning, that Patočka sees the origin of history. It is crucial, though, that the early Greek philosophers' question of the whole, which renders humans free towards and responsible for the meaning of the whole, renders them free not only for truth, but for falsehood. The possibility of a truth for which we are responsible is, at the same time, the possibility of an ever-deepening entanglement in errors and mystifications for which we are responsible. That is the risk Patočka calls history.